It is the first day of the Incorporating Africaribbean Trade and Investment Forum 2024 being held at the Bahamas with the theme Owning Our Destiny, Economic Prosperity on the Platform of Global Africa. Now, some of the remarks on this opening day are expected from John A. Roll, the governor of Central Bank of Bahamas, Professor Yemi Osinbajo, the former vice president of Nigeria, Kevin Greenidge, the governor of the Central Bank of Barbados, and Donald P. Kaberuka, the chairman and the managing partner of Southbridge Group and former president, African Development Bank Group. Let's join live to follow the proceedings and watch as they proceed.
Forum since its inception, the ITC works towards global prosperity by connecting small businesses in developing countries to international markets. And like Africaribbean, ITC sees trade as a powerful tool for inclusive prosperity.
Good morning, everybody. It's always great to be back in the Bahamas. I always enjoy the John canoe and the conch. I'm already planning to get my conch soup and other things. Honorable ladies and gentlemen, honorable prime ministers, heads of government, honorable ministers, heads of agencies, distinguished guests all. Greetings and welcome. I'm delighted to be here with you in Nassau, and it's fitting that we are gathering in New Providence, where we can see evidence of our shared African Caribbean history all around. The John canoe and the music, the vibrancy, the art, it just comes alive, and it's great to be home. I don't need to elaborate on the more painful parts of our shared history, of the trade that ripped families apart and cost countless lives, and whose effects have rippled across generations to this day. For all of us here, myself included, that's part of the very fabric of who we are. But it's important in this dialogue to also see this as a spiritual journey, a homecoming rooted in our common ancestry that goes beyond mere economic engagement. From the more painful parts of our history, we can see clearly that a new story is emerging, a new narrative, as the Vice President just said. A story of resilience, of creativity, a story of global Africa, where the depth and breadth of its diaspora is fully on display. There's some things in my mind that we must do, not merely because it makes sense, but because it represents the healing and recreation of the whole, without which we continue to wander untethered and uprooted. I recall my first trip to Abuja. I had been to many African countries before, and I enjoyed them all. South Africa, Tanzania, Kenya, North Africa. But when I landed in Abuja, I knew that's where we came from. There was no question in my mind that that's where at least my set of Jamaicans came from. None. And it struck me because we all know that Africa is where we came from. But to have that spiritual engagement, that immediate epiphany, that this is where we came from, because it was the attitude. It was what I call the in-your-facedness. It was the confidence. It was the bravado. It was the inability to understand limits. I tell people Jamaica has one of the best issues in the world, in that our greatest strength is also our greatest weakness, which is that we don't recognize limits on either end. And that is awesome, but it can be a problem. At any rate, for me, that just encapsulated that despite 400 and odd years of separation, there is an immediate recognition of where we came from, and that has continued to this day. Nassau is a great city and has a long tradition of celebrating small businesses and what I call the hustle. And it's no surprise that this year's host of the 2024 Africa-Caribbean Trade and Investment Forum and the first Afrexim annual meetings to ever take place in the Caribbean. We've been honored at ITC to take part in the Africa-Caribbean Trade and Investment Forum since its inception, and we'll continue to champion this forum alongside you as it goes from strength to strength. The ties between Africa and the Caribbean are umbilical and they are organic. And it's these ties that can and must carry us through some of the biggest threats that we face, especially in today's polycrisis world. There's, of course, the well-known African saying that if you want to go fast, you go alone. If you want to go far, go together. Challenges like climate change, which bears down on us daily, putting current and future generations at risk. I got into my room at 2:30 this morning. Why? Because the weather in Miami prevented the plane from taking off, and this is just the beginning of the hurricane season, which promises, they say, to be one of the worst in decades. I pray they're wrong. Challenges like supply chain disruptions or food insecurity or environmental degradation or the COVID-19 pandemic's aftermath, all of which can and have undone years of economic progress in short order. But if we're going to tackle these challenges head on, we need more trade and investment between Africa and the Caribbean. That's what will make economic transformation possible, and in a way that benefits both regions by drawing on our shared ties, hopes, and potential. ITC's newest research with Afrexim Bank, which we will soon publish, shows that trade between Africa and the Caribbean holds enormous potential. 1.8 billion for goods and services annually by 2028, to be exact. But we have a long road ahead of us if we're going to actually achieve that potential in practice, because getting to that number means getting rid of trade frictions and getting investments into the right sectors. I was on the bus this morning coming with one of the venture capitalists who set up in Jamaica. I was really happy to hear that, and I think he's already inked a deal with the Development Bank of Jamaica. So we're very happy to hear that. The past decade alone, for instance, shows that the share of African exports that goes to the Caribbean has been decreasing, not increasing. Today, less than 0.1% of African exports go to the Caribbean, and less than 3% of Caribbean exports go to the African continent. And looking past sheer volume, we can also see those exports in either direction remain far too concentrated in just a handful of sectors with little value addition, like unprocessed chemicals and minerals, despite all that these two regions have to offer. That's despite the potential that we see in exports like machinery, electricity, plastics, rubber, processed food products, and mineral products. And once again, it reflects our colonial history. It reflects the terms of trade that were established 400 years ago, and they haven't changed. And I think one of the fundamental decisions that we need to make as we move forward in planning for 2063, in planning for the future, is to undo those terms of trade. Too often, it's high tariffs and non-tariff barriers that are holding this export potential back. What's worse is that these barriers are often more pronounced for these goods that have undergone processing, meaning that value addition, which is critical for better jobs and livelihoods, becomes counterproductive once it's clear what exporters we face at the border. It shouldn't be that way, and it doesn't have to be. We must also do far more to boost services between the two regions, services trade. We already see how trade in travel, all of you are here, and transport services are doing relatively well, which, given the extraordinary cultural and culinary traditions our regions have and the beauty of their natural environments, should come as no surprise. There's a clear foundation we can build on. Trade agreements are one way to help bring down barriers and open new opportunities. We already have useful precedents that show us what works and what doesn't, and what can be improved, such as the economic partnership agreements in both regions with the EU. And while we need to come together to understand what an African-Caribbean trade framework could look like, down the line, we can and must do more to improve economic integration with these two regions themselves, developing value chains further and seeing where the pain points are. It's why so many of ITC's projects in Africa and the Caribbean, whether it's our new project to support greater food security in the Caribbean or our long-standing projects to develop value chains in East and West Africa, are designed with these goals in mind. It's why we have a dedicated program called One Trade Africa to ensure that small businesses, especially those led by women and youth, can take full part in one of the most transformational trade agreements to be negotiated in a generation, the African Continental Free Trade Area. Together with Afrexim Bank, we have trained close to 10,000 SMEs through a dedicated online trading platform called How to Export under the AFCFTA. It's why we're launching a new project with Afrexim Bank to turbocharge trade and investment between Africa and the Caribbean. Together, we will focus on developing 5 priority value chains that have major potential for inclusive and sustainable economic transformation, led by the two regions' small businesses while tackling food security and other risks we face. Projects like these have also taught us, however, that value chain development and small business competitiveness can only get us so far. Too often, poor logistics infrastructure is getting in the way of greater trade, both within Africa and the Caribbean and between them. Both regions scored the lowest on the World Bank Logistics Performance Index. And unless we invest more in changing that, then even our best efforts at spurring greater interregional trade and investment will be for naught. It's clear that we have a lot of work ahead of us, and it's not going to be easy. But it is events like ACTIV where the big conversations, the ones that lead to real change in the ground, happen. On the ground, sorry. It's only 3 hours sleep. I feel like I'm in the ground right now. We saw that last year in Guyana and the year before in Bridgetown, and I know that we'll see this week in Nassau. It is why we begin to explore the possibility of an FTA between Africa and the Caribbean, to remove these artificial barriers and create new opportunities. I can already hear the naysayers, the prophets of doom, what I call scoffers in the stands and the hecklers in the penny section. And that's okay. I'd like to posit that if a region as small as the Caribbean can negotiate a reciprocal free trade agreement with Europe, then why should we not be able to do one with Africa? As my son would say, make it make sense, Mom. I recall very, very well, and I'm dating myself here, but the same dismissal of the nascent Pan-African movement led by stalwarts like Dr. Kwame Nkrumah, Jomo Kenyatta, Mwalimu, Julius Nyerere, Kenneth Kaunda, and others, that initiated a wave of decolonization and independence across not just Africa, but the entire diaspora in the 50s to 60s, that changed the map of the world forever. And it's easy to stand on the sidelines and criticize and throw stones. But we have an opportunity to make fundamental change, and that opportunity is now. I will end by just reading one of my favorite quotes because I think it says everything, and I'll praise it. So it's not the critic who counts. The credit belongs to the man who's actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, who strives valiantly, who errs, who comes short again and again, who at the best knows in the end the triumph of high achievement, and who at the worst, if he fails, at least fails while daring greatly. I'd like to ask us to dare greatly. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Program Director Mark. I also wish to acknowledge the presence of Your Excellency, the presidents, the former presidents, vice presidents, the Professor Orama, president of and the chairman of Africaribbean Bank. I also wish to acknowledge the vice president of Africaribbean Bank, Mrs. Kanyaho, the executive vice president of Inter-Africa Trade Bank, all executive and senior managers of Africaribbean Bank, the governor of Central Bank of Commonwealth of Bahamas, all ministers and deputy ministers, Your Excellencies, members of the diplomatic corps, governors, and respective African countries, as well as the various banks, the CEOs and captains of industries, all leaders, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, members of the media. On behalf of the South African government and our people, we also wish to extend our deepest condolence to the nation of Malawi for the tragic loss of the esteemed Vice President, Mr. Chilima, who was killed in a tragic accident with other passengers. We share in your grief and stand with you in this incredible, difficult time. Program Director, today we gather to explore the profound transformation unfolding across Africa. I'm reminded of the intricate tapestry that connects our African continent, not only internally, but also globally. It is crucial to recognize that Africa's journey towards prosperity involves not just intra-Africa trade, but also integration with the vast African diaspora spread around the world. The story of Africa is incomplete without acknowledging the contribution and struggle of its people, many of whom have been displaced through no fault of their own. One of the critical links in this global network is the relationship between Africa and the Caribbean. The ties between our regions run deep, forged through shared histories of colonialism, resistance, and the resistance. The Caribbean has also played a pivotal role in the struggle against apartheid, standing in solidarity with us in South Africa as our brothers and sisters. The first democratically elected president of South Africa, the father of our nation, Nelson Mandela, once said, "During my lifetime, I have dedicated my life to the struggle for African people. I have fought against white domination, and I have fought against black domination. I have cherished the ideal of a democratic and a free society in which all persons live together in harmony with equal opportunities." The Africa unity that Kwame Nkrumah spoke of isn't about political borders, but also about bringing the gap that divide us across oceans and continents. It is about recognizing that our destinies are intertwined and that our collective strength lies in unity. Reflecting on this journey thus far, it is evident that Africa has traversed great distances. Gone are the days when our continent was mired in conflict. Our continent was mired in disease, famine, shackled by the weight of its colonial past. Today, we stand tall amongst the many landscape of democracy, open economies, and relative political stability amongst our African continent. Yet, despite many of these strides we have made, challenges persist. Africa, comprising 17% of world's population, commands only just 4% of the GDP and mere 2% of world manufacturing outputs. Our share of the world trade stands just a mere modest 3%, a figure dwarfed by the intra-regional trade volumes in our continent. However, within the statistics lies a glimmer of hope. Intra-Africa export has seen a notable uptick, accounting for 16.3% of total trade in recent years, While this pales the comparison for the regions, it is also underscores the potential that lies amongst us within our borders. It is heartening to note that over the 3/4 of the trade that occurs within our regional blocs, it signals the growing intra-Africa economic ecosystem, which we should all be proud of, but also work very hard to ensure that this goes even higher. The African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement marks a significant milestone in our quest for economic emancipation, aiming at creating a single market over 1 billion consumers with GDP exceeding $3 trillion. In its testament to our commitment of overcoming the barriers that have hindered Africa's full potential in the global economy. South Africa's commitment to inter-Africa trade is underscored by the fact that over 20% of our trade occurs within the continent, with a South African Development Cooperation SADC playing a crucial role. We too are very eager, ladies and gentlemen, to see more growth of our trade in the East, not and most importantly in the West of Africa. The successful implementation of AfTA agreement is expected to lead to diversification of export, increased productive capacity, accelerating of growth, increased investment, and increased employment opportunities and incomes, and most importantly, broadening the economic inclusion of both South Africa and the rest of our continent. As South Africa, we made an implementation of the preferential trade agreement a reality when we sent our first shipment of products at the port of Durban to Ghana and Kenya, trading under this agreement. South Africa is the first among many of our African continent, the South African Customs Union member, which consists of Botswana, Lesotho, Namibia, South Africa, and Swaziland, to practically realize our AfTA agreement. And we're very excited that many of our African countries are really realizing this huge potential. As with many of our African continent countries, the start of the preferential trade creates a great opportunities for growth and development. One significant aspect of this agreement is recognizing of the role of our special economic zones in driving the economic growth. This recent adoption of the ministerial regulations of the treatment of products from SCZ underscores this commitment. Program Director, I would also be remiss if I do not give you the key highlights of my province of KwaZulu-Natal in South Africa. KwaZulu-Natal is South Africa's second largest economy, contributing an average of 16% to the economic GDP. We share borders with Mozambique, Swaziland, Lesotho, and this puts all of us in the strategic position to utilize the infrastructure development to stimulate our economy, creating jobs and bridge the inequalities that still create poverty amongst our community. We have about 600 kilometers of coastline, and we are a port province. Ports are a backbone of every country's economy and assist in the stimulation of our economy. KwaZulu-Natal is strategically positioned by being home to two of the Africa's busiest, largest ports, Durban and the Richards Bay. It is also boasts the third highest export propensity and the second highest level of industrialization in our country. We are working to modernize our ports and road freight logistics. We're also working through digitization, taking advantage of the rollout of the broadband infrastructure. We are also aware that the congestion that is being caused in our ports is making us lose a lot in our economy. So the rollout of the infrastructure delivery will empower the local emerging contractors and create much needed jobs for our economy. Just like many of the countries, and my colleague also spoke about it here, The issues of climate change are some of the issues that we need to make sure that we work around. Climate change presents another huge challenge for many of our infrastructure planning as well as our communities. KwaZulu-Natal has emerged as a hub of industrial development in the sub-Saharan Africa and may be attributed to the unmatched natural resource endowment, exceptional productivity, and the capacity that we have, well-developed first world infrastructure, and the advantage of being a coastal location. The economic activity is also concentrated in the metropolitan areas of Durban, Pietermaritzburg, Richards Bay, within the coastal belt, and it utilizes many of our areas such as the subtropical fruits and vegetables as well as the sugarcane plantations. We are also modernizing the existing infrastructure to enhance the efficiencies, the reliability, while promoting the energy conservation to balance the demand. Through the collaboration of these industries, stakeholders, and international partners, we are also harnessing the collective expertise to also overcome these challenges and pave the way for a resilient, sustainable energy landscape. As we look to the future, let us heed the words of our leaders such as Julius Nyerere, who famously said, "If a door is shut, attempt should be made to open it. If it is ajar, it should be pushed until it is wide open. In neither the case should be open or be blown up and should be taken, or in case it should be inside. Let us stand together as one continent, one people, united in our quest for prosperity and progress." Ladies and gentlemen, we need to stand in the cusp of a new era in Africa, in the African continent and African economic history. Let us seize the opportunities that lie before us. Let us harness the power of regional cooperation, innovation, entrepreneurship to propel our province as well as our continent to greater heights. Together, we can define Africa's narrative, transforming it from a land of untapped potential to the beacon of prosperity and progress. I'm also reminded by Nelson Mandela's enduring wisdom, where he said, "It is always seem impossible until it is done." Let us seize this moment, harnessing the power of collaboration, cooperation, to build a brighter future for the generations to come. I thank you.
Now, there's an old saying that goes, never let a good crisis go to waste. It's often attributed to Winston Churchill incorrectly. But anyway, we certainly are seeing an intersection of crisis in this world. It's fractured and it's an uncertain world where realignment is the order of the day. And it can seem like it's every man and woman for him or herself. Now, our first thematic session is asking the question, How do we build resilience in an era of globalization? Our moderator for this session is the CEO of Gateway Partners. He's also the chair of the investment committee of the Fund for Export Development in Africa, FEDER. Please give a warm welcome to Mr. Viswanathan Shankar.
Your Excellencies, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, a very good morning to all of you. We are here to recognize and celebrate the power and promise of global Africa, a 2 billion community that has the potential to catalyze and turbocharge the Africa rising narrative. There is no better representative or embodiment of the global African story than our keynote speaker, Dr. Roger Ferguson. He was the first African American to be nominated, as the vice chair of the US Federal Reserve. Let's give that an applause. He was also, for more than a decade, the president and CEO of TIAA, the Teachers Insurance and Annuity Association, a $1 trillion behemoth. Dr. Ferguson has advised many presidents, he's chaired many global councils. We are delighted, honored that he could join us today and share his thoughts on building resilience in a deglobalized world. In particular, how African and Caribbean nations can navigate the world in an era where globalization seems to be fragile, if not broken beyond redemption and repair. Welcome to the stage with a thunderous applause, Dr. Roger Ferguson.
Thank you very much for that very, very kind introduction. It really is an honor and a pleasure for me to be here today to speak to this annual meeting of the African Export-Import Bank, I think held for the very first time here in what I will describe as the New World. And I want to congratulate the organizers for putting together such an impressive event. So let me be very clear as I start, I am not an expert on the economy or the businesses of any African nation. You all know more about that than I do. Therefore, I'm not going to presume to lecture you on the best policies or procedures for your companies, your nation states, your central banks, your finance ministers. I think there's actually far too much lecturing going on when it comes to others who are not from the continent speaking to people who are still on the continent. So I'm going to address the topic of resilience and building resilience in an era of deglobalization from my perspective as African American, with the focus on the US economy, which is really much more my home territory. However, I hope to draw a number of lessons that might be relevant to you, and you can then decide among these lessons which ones you really want to focus on and work with. So let me start with the topic. This topic of resilience during an era of deglobalization is in fact a global topic. It is one that's on the minds of policymakers, commentators, economists, business folks alike, as well as, very importantly, the average citizen. It's not of interest just to Africa, not of interest just to the Caribbean region. It's a topic that is, as I said, relevant to all jurisdictions. So why is that the case? Why is this topic of resilience during this era of uncertainty a global one? I think the answer is really in front of us. After several decades of what in general has been quiescence and economic prosperity, generally not universally experienced, known in the central bank community as the, quote, great moderation, the past few years have been ones of great global upset and turmoil and turbulence in economics, in health, in business, and in security, importantly. As a broad generalization, and recognizing there are exceptions, it's fair to say that the global business community went from a period of generally low inflation and steady growth, in which macroeconomic turbulence was quickly offset, often by central banks, to a period of sharply rising inflation, as we heard from the central bank governor, and frankly, very uncertain macroeconomic prospects. Just in the past 24 months, the global economic community has asked for the US, or if the US, will have a hard landing, a soft landing, or no landing at all. Will interest rates go up? Will they go down? Will they remain steady? All of those with a big impact on the rest of the globe. Emerging market policymakers went from a period of relatively low interest rates coming from the world's major central banks, thereby allowing EM debtors to manage dollar-denominated debt reasonably well, to a period of rapidly rising and relatively high dollar interest rates with concomitant effects on debt service burdens and global prospects. We went from a period of gradually increasing global trade and economic interconnectedness, triggered, as all of you know, by the fall of the Berlin Wall and the expansion of the WTO, to a period in which many policymakers and business leaders are confronting a world divided potentially into two trading blocs, one of which faces west to the US and Western Europe, and one of which will potentially face east, so to speak, to China and possibly Russia. We went from a period of health crises, which were devastating but relatively regional, not to be minimized or ignored, to a health crisis that became global. And finally, and most importantly, we went from a period when armed conflicts, and they did exist, were regional and not to be ignored, to a period when armed conflicts are global and involve potentially nuclear deterrence. So as I said, economic resilience is of broad concern, not just to policymakers and business leaders, to individuals as well. And so why are individuals worried about economic resilience? Well, every year, a group called the Edelman Trust Barometer surveys 32,000 respondents across 28 countries. And the participants come from all geographies in the African continent. South Africa, Nigeria, and Kenya are well represented, as well as US, China, India, and others. The most recent survey highlighted a dramatic collapse in economic confidence and optimism. The percentage of respondents who agreed with the statement, "My family will be better off in 5 years," declined by 10 points between 2019 and 2023, globally, from around 53% to 40%. In South Africa, the number agreeing their family will be better off in 5 years declined from 66% to roughly 55%, so 11 points. In Nigeria, the number declined by about 19 points, from 87% to 68%. And in Kenya, which had the highest percent agreeing with the statement, the number agreeing dipped 11 points from around 91% to 80%. So clearly, families are concerned about their own economic resilience. So let me now turn to this concept of resilience. We all have a sense of what it means, but I'm going to actually try to dig into it just a little bit, looking at 3 or 4 different disciplines to bring out some subtlety and nuance. Then after that, I'll turn to the question of globalization or deglobalization, then some of the challenges that I think we need to talk about. So what is resilience? There are many definitions, but if one thinks about it, not from the standpoint of economics and business, which we know so well, but examples from other disciplines. So let me start with mental health and psychoanalysis, and then if I go through these, I'll then summarize what it is I think we can learn that will give us a deeper understanding of resilience. So in psychology, psychological resilience is, quote, the adaptation of the person's psychological traits, so traits are very important, and experiences that allow them to regain or remain in a healthy mental state during a crisis without long-term negative context. And so what psychologists tell us is that both internal and external factors can influence a person's resilience, factors such as self-esteem and social networks. More importantly, for economists and others, psychologists tell us that resilience can be enhanced through interventions and strategies, so that's a very important learning. So what do you know about resilience from natural ecosystems? So in ecology, resilience is the capacity of a system to respond to a disturbance by resisting damage, so resisting damage and then recovering. It's defined in 2 ways in that discipline. It's first the time required for a system to return to an equilibrium, and then the capacity of a system to absorb disturbance and reorganize while undergoing change. Very importantly for economics and business, that second definition means that there might be different states of outcome after perturbation, after a challenge. So resilience, at least in ecology, does not mean returning to exactly the state before. There might be a separate state that might emerge. Then finally, in IT, in the world of technology, widely discussed as a critical issue among computer scientists, especially in terms of data centers and cloud computing. And so what do computer scientists have to say to us about resilience? The first thing that's really important to them is resilience is not either or. There are degrees of resilience to think about. And no system is perfectly resistant to any kind of challenge. The second thing that computer scientists tell us that's really important is that we should presume that there will be disturbances to technology systems and to other systems. And the third is that what political scientists look at, computer scientists in particular, is the need to protect critical assets. That's not the same as protecting all assets. So let me now summarize or take those lessons into our economic and business world. First, I believe that we should recognize, like computer scientists, that adverse conditions are inevitable in finance and trade and business, economics, and related fields. So therefore, we want to, as they say in computer science, develop systems that can detect threatening changes and respond to them quickly. Additionally, like computer scientists, we should recognize that resilience is not absolute. It's not final. Therefore, we have to think through not fully resilient systems, but increasing the resilience of our systems. So that's the second major lesson. Third, we should take from psychology that resilience is a notion we want to maintain, quote, a healthy state. That's particularly important when we think about, some of the things that drive what a healthy state might look like, and we'll come back and talk about those in a minute. Fourth, like a computer scientist, we should define successful resilience as ability to carry out critical missions, which is not the same as every mission that was done before, but the critical missions. And then finally, as I said, we have to understand that the attacks on resilience can be both internal and external. And then sixth, obviously, the lesson I focused on earlier, which is that there can be practices and tools that increase resilience. So what does this mean for us as business leaders and policymakers, et cetera? First, we must not promise our citizens, our customers, our partners, absolute resilience. We should promise that we're going to be building things that are more resilient. And how do we do that? Through 5 different things. We want to first develop or learn internal capacities, capabilities, and tools that allow us to become more resilient over time. So learning how to become resilient is very important. Those tools, resiliency tools, have to identify shocks before they occur, so the ability to look over the horizon to anticipate resilience, or shocks to resilience. Third lesson is those shocks could be either internal to our own economic systems or external. Fourth, importantly, systems respond by protecting major priority assets, not all assets all the time. And then finally, and most importantly, we have to recognize that at the other end of a shock, we could have different kinds of outcomes, some better, some worse. And so I think we just have to be much more nuanced in our understanding of this word resilience. I'm going to have a conversation with Shankar here in a minute, and perhaps we can talk about, from the US experience, what some of those experiences have been. But obviously 9/11 comes to mind, when the Federal Reserve really adopted and moved very quickly to respond to the challenges. And then perhaps we can talk, at least in the US context, about the very, very slow growth that occurred after the crisis. So first lesson, resilience has more detail and more nuance than perhaps the common thinking. Second lesson I want to share with you is what are the characteristics of resilient systems? First, we know that resilient systems are diverse. Any natural system that has only one species, ecologists tell us, is more subject to fatal diseases that may target that species. Any team that does not have diversity of thinking is subject to groupthink. Any economy or any business that is overly dependent on one trading partner or one expert or one export is subject to vagaries that might hit a market or a counterparty. And any financial system that is overly concentrated in one location might be under attack. That's called a choke point. Second characteristic of resilient systems is redundancy, having a backup. A system with no backup has the inability to do what's called failover from technology. The third element of resilient systems, resilient societies, resilient businesses, is flexibility. In the face of a shock, in the face of a crisis, the ability to change direction, to respond, to be flexible is very, very important. Rigidity in the face of a shock can lead to brittleness. So buildings, bridges, they're built to sway with the winds, even very high winds. So a question of, is your business, is your economy built to sway, so to speak, with the high winds? And then finally, resilient systems tend to have an interconnectedness. One of the discussions here, obviously, is about building trade networks, et cetera, and interconnectedness. So there are some lessons we can learn on what resilience looks like, and very importantly, there are lessons we can learn on how to build more resilient systems. Let me now go to the second topic of the theme here, which is, quote, building resilience in a period of deglobalization. And if you allow me, I want to rephrase that. I think we're in an era of re-globalization. To me, deglobalization implies that countries and economic units are turning inward. And there's some evidence of that for sure. But I think it's likely to think about our global system not as deglobalizing, but as rather as restructuring and reordering how globalization proceeds. So I think of this as re-globalization. So first, we should understand what is happening with global trade. Global trade has actually followed a highly volatile pattern since the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic. Fragmentation and increased heterogeneity have come to characterize trade. So there was a rebound in trade in 21 and 22, significant decline in 23, expected volume growth this year and next year. Importantly, while the value of global trade fell about 3% in 2023, the trade of developing countries and South-South trade performed worse than the global averages. Second point to know about the globalization that we've experienced over the past several years, 30 years or so, and what might happen in a re-globalized world, is that it was almost primarily, not exclusively, but strongly driven by the introduction of China into the World Trade Organization. Towards the end of the 1970s, as all of you know, China began a set of reforms to upgrade its economy, open to the rest of the world. In the end of the 1970s, before they joined the WTO, China, global trade, its share of global trade was less than 1%. By 2020, China accounted for roughly 15% of the world economy. And we're now aware, of course, of tensions mounting, but the concept of globalization, re-globalization has a great deal to do with how the rest of the world responds to changes in China, for example. The final point I want to make here is that this re-globalization, as we think about it, will also have to deal with another major billion-person economic actor, and that is India. India, unlike China, but like many countries in this meeting, is in the midst of a massive demographic dividend that will last for 2 decades. So China pursued manufacturing-led growth very successfully. The question is, will the next big billion individual economy, billion plus in India, pursue that model or pursue another model? So why do I raise that here? Because I think for many countries, how China deals with re-globalization, how India deals with its development in the global context may limit and change the opportunities that we all confront as we think about developing our own businesses. So now let me now turn to the third topic, and then Shankar and I will have the conversation that we would like to have. So what are the issues that could be attacking or challenging us in this world against which we have to be resilient? First and foremost, income and wealth inequality within and among nations. While globally wealth has gone up quite dramatically during this period of globalization across many economies, it has certainly been unevenly distributed. And that has become much more visible. I think that's driving some of the political unrest that we see in my own country, maybe in other countries as well. And so one of the challenges to the business community, to the trade community, the policy community, domestically, globally, within and across nations, is income and wealth inequality. Second challenge that we have to confront and think about is financial security for both aging societies, such as China and Europe, but also societies with younger populations, such as many in this room, who can in fact benefit, if you do it well, from the demographic dividend that comes with having so many young citizens. But if not handled well, financial insecurity for younger individuals can end up being more of a demographic time bomb or demographic disaster. And so the dividend from demography, or the challenge from demography, is the second issue that we have to confront as we think about becoming more resilient over the next several years. The third issue that's of relevance to all of us is health concerns. Been known regionally, perhaps in certain regions, has become very much a national and global challenge. And out of that has come a real recognition of health inequalities, both within nations and between nations. Just thinking about the access to the COVID vaccine, how unevenly that was distributed around the world and within countries is very important. In my own country, in the US, we often talk about your health outcomes depend very much on your zip code, i.e. where you live. And so even in the richest nation, health inequities, health concerns are very important. The fourth issue that we're going to have to confront as we think about building resilient societies and resilient businesses is educational demands that will allow all of our citizens, particularly the young, to participate in new technologies. And there's quite a bit of debate in the US, and I suspect in many of your economies. What is the value of what we used to describe as the liberal arts education versus what we describe as a STEM, a science, technology, engineering education? Very importantly, what's the value of classroom education versus apprenticeships, a la the German model, in terms of bringing the next generation successfully into the world of being productive, particularly in the world that we're going to turn to next, which is the challenge of technology. AI. What does all of that mean in terms of how we build and construct more resilient businesses? Is it a challenge? Yes. Is it an opportunity? Absolutely. How do we move it from challenge to opportunity? And then the final of the global challenges that we all confront, and we heard it mentioned here already, is global climate change. And the question for all of us is, while we will have climate change, obviously, does this create some opportunities? I've heard a colleague mention the phrase green collar jobs. Is there an opportunity in the global south, as it's sometimes called, to participate in a very constructive way in mitigating and making society more resilient against climate change? So let me conclude and sit and have my conversation with Shankar by just summarizing what I've tried to share with you in the last 15 or 20 minutes. First, our topic of resilience, what I shared is that there's nuance around the topic of resilience. Shocks can occur to any system. So we've got to be wary of promising or thinking that we can create systems that are completely failure-proof. No system is fully resilient. Resilience is a matter of degree. However, we do know we can make our systems more resilient by making them more diverse, creating redundancy, creating more flexibility and maybe a more networked system, and by practicing the skills and the traits that make systems, businesses, economies more resilient. Secondly, I pointed out that resilient systems respond in part by protecting their assets, but very importantly, prioritizing assets. So knowing what your critical assets are for critical functions versus assets that might have to change after a period of shock is going to be very important. And the final point I made, and we can talk about it a bit more, is after a shock, systems can either be at a high optimal level or a suboptimal level. I'd be happy to explore that with Shankar. Second major point I made is that globalization or deglobalization may not be the right way to think about it. It may really be reglobalization. And reglobalization will have to do with how China, one of the major trading engines in the world, responds to the changes that it is confronting. What does that mean about how they look for new trading partners, and what does that mean for the economies in this room? Similarly, I would say reglobalization will have to take into account of what the other billion-person economy does, which is India. And so all of us will have to deal with that and figure out the role that we all play collectively, confronting in some ways our own billion-person economies, if we think about Africa collectively, versus individually. And so this whole notion of re-globalization, not de-globalization, is something I want you to think about. And finally, and most importantly, I listed 5 or 6 topics that we're all going to have to think about in terms of how we make our systems, our economies, our businesses more resilient. Income and wealth inequality, health inequality, demographic dividend or demographic time bomb. How do we think about education and training? How do we think about new technologies, opportunity or challenge from AI? And then most importantly, how do we consider climate change? So I want to thank you very much for your attention. I look forward to exploring these topics with Shankar for the next 20 or 30 minutes. And again, I really commend you on putting together such a phenomenal program, and it's seen so many phenomenal leaders in one room. So thank you very much.
Remarks, Roger. A true doctoral dissertation on what was a very complex topic. No wonder you're a doctor.
Yes.
Ferguson. Okay. So, you mentioned September 11th, the unfortunate incident. And if I remember right, you were the only senior person from the Fed Reserve who was in Washington, D.C. that day that dastardly acts occurred. And it was an external shock.
Yes.
As going back to the terminology you used. These are not things that you're actually prepared for. So what were some of the things that you had to go through at that point of time? Just walk us through.
So yes, I was the only governor in charge, or president in Washington, which meant that I was the governor in charge of the Fed's initial response, which effectively meant, response for stabilizing the U.S. financial system and markets, global financial systems and markets, but very importantly, creating confidence that, this dastardly attack on 2 buildings in New York City would not bring the U.S. or global economy to a stand. And so there are 3 or 4 things that immediately came to mind. First was that one, in a crisis, has to be very clear about what your primary goal and objective is. And my primary goal and objective at that point was to use all the tools of the Fed to create the kind of stability we talked about. And once I declared that that was the theory of the case, then thousands of people knew exactly what to do. There was no ambiguity. The second lesson there was one has to be able to clearly communicate in simple terms, because during a crisis, during a period of uncertainty, particularly if you're a central banker or responsible as we were for global financial stability, you have to speak very clearly. A lot of chatter, a lot of uncertainty, quite literally smoke, as well as figurative smoke. And so we issued some relatively simple statements. The Federal Reserve will be open and operating. Simple statement. In technical terms, we'll use all of our resources to provide all the liquidity required. Very simple statement. The third lesson, and I alluded to it in my doctoral speech here, was the need to be flexible. So there are things we had never done before. We had never formally thought of our balance sheet, which has now become a tool. We hadn't thought of that as a tool before 9/11, when we chose very explicitly to provide ample liquidity, even knowing that the balance sheet would expand quite dramatically. We had never actually done many swaps with other central banks. So, flexibility is really important. And the third thing is to use what I would describe as smart fortitude. Why do I emphasize smart fortitude? Stupid fortitude is pretending nothing bad is happening and expecting people to believe it. Smart fortitude is saying a lot of uncertainty, bad things are happening, and yet still we must achieve our mission. And so those are some of the lessons that came forward here. And in the context of the talk, I think the real issue is when the system confronted shocks, the ability to be flexible and to respond, since it wasn't a shock that was anticipated, and to develop new tools and new techniques. So those are some of the major lessons.
So you were the vice chairman and you had to handle this. Where was your boss?
Well,
Alan Greenspan.
Alan Greenspan was stuck in Basel. All of you know, or most of you know, that central bankers meet quite regularly in Basel, Switzerland. And so he and I would alternate who would go to Basel. It turned out to be his meeting cycle to represent the Fed and the U.S. government at Basel, and mine to stay home, literally in case something happened. And so he was flying across the Atlantic. The plane had to turn around, return back to Switzerland. He was out of touch for the vast majority of the day. And when he finally landed and got through to me, he did two things. He said, "What have you done?" I've explained, we issued a statement, we are open, we're doing these things. And he did the second thing that's really most important, which is he said, "Sounds like you've done everything. I cannot micromanage from this far away. You have all the authority you need to drive this forward and keep doing the right things." When he finally got back to the Fed building the next day, so 36 hours after the attack, he went to a quiet corner office. I didn't know what he was doing. He called in senior staffers. He asked them how things had gone. And he called me in and said, "I understand from all our colleagues in the system that you've done an outstanding job. Though I have returned," he said, "and I'm the chairman of the board here, you have the authority to keep running the system, in my name with my authority for the rest of this week."
Fantastic.
Which was a fantastic testament to me. Thank you. But it was also a fantastic testament to him.
Exactly.
Right? Because he could have easily, if he wanted to be driven by his own ego, grabbed the reins. But he was wise enough to know that if after all this perturbation and challenge things were stabilizing, then he should step back, and he did.
So you just mentioned that you were not only trying to stabilize the US system, but also the global financial system. Very often there is a view in the rest of the world that when US sets monetary policy, it's purely looking at the interests of the United States, and often it could hurt regions like Africa. How much does actually the international dimension go into the decision making? Since you had a seat at that table at the top.
No, I was at the board for roughly a decade and went through 80 different policy setting meetings. So the answer is mixed. And why do I say it's mixed? To be very clear, when the Fed sets monetary policy as they're doing today, it is exclusively by law with focus on its dual mandate in the US. Interest, inflation, and unemployment. Full stop. And that one has to understand, as I sort of implied, but we can be clearer, when the Fed raises rates, it has massive impact across the emerging market economies, has been the source of very serious dislocations. There are other policy constructs, however, that we are engaged in that are much more international, where we actually do think about how all this works globally. And so when I was at the Fed, I chaired our payment system where we had to think, as you do, about how to create a global networked payment system to create easier movements of currencies and payments across border. Obviously, the whole question of bank regulation has to be done in a global context, so there's something called the Basel Committee. And so I think the global community has to recognize there are places, frankly, where by law the Fed has to be focused only on the domestic, and there are other places where we are part of an international dialogue. When I was there, I chaired a committee on Y2K, I chaired a committee on what's called the Global Financial System, reported to the World Bank and IMF as the chair of something called the Financial Stability Board. And so there are plenty of roles where we take an international hat, but frankly, with monetary policy, it's meant to be by law an exclusively domestic hat.
So Roger, you talked about re-globalization, but if you just go back to the world of globalization, a key underpinning of that, or if you want to call it the pipe, the lubricant, has actually been the US dollar.
Yes.
I know the US dollar is more the domain of the Treasury and not the Fed. But obviously you will have definitely views on it. The US has been increasingly imposing sanctions and weaponizing the dollar. Is that contributing to deglobalization or reglobalization? And what do you see the role of the US dollar going forward as a result of that?
Well, I think US dollar is going to still be the reserve currency of the globe for a number of reasons. One is the vast majority of trade is still denominated in dollars. Two, the US financial market is still the engine of financial behaviors globally. And frankly, number three is it really is not an alternative at this stage. You know, the Chinese would like for the renminbi to be more of an international currency, but if that's going to be the case, you have to really, they will have to make it fully convertible and, you know, do a number of other things, which they haven't done, and I think it will take them quite a while to do it. So I do think that the dollar is still going to be the reserve currency for the working lives of people in this room, and I think probably for generations to come. Having said that, you know, the question of how the dollar and how the dollar-based payment system, you didn't mention SWIFT, but that's part of that, comes into play, has forced a number of people, policymakers and others, to think about alternatives. But I think it's going to be very, very difficult to, you know, develop such alternatives. Having said that, when I was involved in the oversight of SWIFT, it was very clear that that was meant to be an international utility, and I think we only got to, you know, politicizing SWIFT as a last resort because of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. It is not anyone's preferred outcome, because I think we'd all do better if we have a payment system that's widely perceived to be, you know, sort of apolitical and distinct from politics. So I'd like to get back to that stage, and, you know, I think we will get there, but we're going through a very, very unusual time right now.
Okay, so in your remarks you mentioned about the rise of China and also the rise of India. But if you just go back in economic history post-World War II, particularly around the 60s, many African nations equaled in terms of per capita GDP, the per capita GDP of many of the Asian tigers and dragons.
Right.
In fact, probably exceeded it. And then you had the Asian miracle of the tigers and dragons. Two questions really. What can Africa do today to replicate the success of the Asian tigers and dragons? And are the conditions, the playing conditions, changed that they got to do it differently? And if so, what would they be?
So let me start with the second question. And one of the reasons I talked about China and India in this space, but you put your finger on others as well, is I think that the conditions for development, financially, economically, et cetera, have in fact changed because we've had, you know, these movements of China, the so-called Asian tigers, now India. That's not necessarily negative. It could be a very positive thing. So as we think about China going from being a manufacturer of, frankly, early on low quality, low value added products to now slightly higher, they are trying to build an economy that's much more dependent on their own individuals' domestic consumption. So what is the role of you know, African nations, Caribbean nations, and other nations in trading with China, not purely in terms of raw goods, raw commodities, you know, but also manufactured goods and stepping up. So, you know, I would say that the circumstances have changed because, you know, the world that existed when China, you know, emerged with the so-called China shock in manufacturing, I think can no longer happen. New things will have to emerge. So that's the way I think about it. As I think about some of the things that particularly the Tigers did very, very well, and we've talked about it, I talked about it a little bit in my remarks. One was education. You know, if one thinks about what China did, they created a very educated population ready to do, you know, first-class, world-class manufacturing. You know, coming in, you know, off of the massive number of peasants, et cetera. And so the question that I raised here, that I raise again, is, you know, education, particularly when you have the potential demographic benefits that many countries in this room have, is going to be extraordinarily important. So if I wanted to learn a lesson from the Tigers, it was about education. The second lesson was very much around infrastructure. The third lesson, and this one may be more challenging, is around capital. So if one thinks about how one of the things that China did to grow was, intentionally, unintentionally, I don't know, but look at all the Asian tigers, very high local savings rates to fund investments in local currencies. Can't always be done everywhere, but it's certainly sort of one of the lessons. So how do we think about education? How do we think about infrastructure, broadly defined? And how do we think about savings so that countries are not so totally dependent on sort of dollar-denominated borrowing and lending, et cetera.
So they built a fantastic infrastructure to aid growth. They also had the institutions, education, and other institutions to turbocharge growth. But what was the role, if any, of incentives?
Oh, the incentives were very clear. I mean, certainly one thinks about the tigers, certainly if you want to think about China. One of the things that drove China, as you well know, was Deng Xiaoping's reform, creating, frankly, we had different phrases for it, capitalism, Chinese characteristics, et cetera, but a very serious for-profit motive. One of the things I'm studying is the future of capitalism. I am a capitalist. So I think a profit incentive is the best tool that we've ever learned to help individuals and ultimately societies, sort of move forward. The question becomes, this was true in China, it's true in the US now, we also have to pay for public goods. So how do you create the right set of incentives, but also put in the right sets of tax systems and regulations so that, human incentives don't take us to extreme places. So one of the things that we've learned in the US 100 and some years ago is unfettered capitalism with people creating tainted food and spoiling the environment, all those things, that's not allowable. So the issue of balancing private sector incentives in the form of capitalism with appropriate regulation to create the needed resources for public goods as well is, I think, one of the balancing acts that has to occur.
And if you look at this, the rise of Asia, it was also at a time when the world was open to trade. It
Absolutely.
was the golden era of globalization. Right. Today, Africa is suffering headwinds on that count. In that context, what do you see the role of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement? Well,
look, I think it's critical. So one of the things I said, implied about resilient systems is that they're networked. And it's a basic, tenet of economics. You sort of have specialization and you have free trade. And so the question of trade within the continent, the question of trade between the continent and the Caribbean, which is being discussed here, critically important. I would also say, though, as the US and China decouple, the opportunities for African nations, other nations to come in and substitute their goods and services for those that China was previously creating should be quite relevant. So one of the re-globalization themes, I will describe as deglobalization, is nearshoring and friendshoring. Well, we certainly see that happening vis-a-vis the US and Mexico. There are some tensions, but the question of what role does Africa play, what role does the Caribbean play, and all of that is important. I think the challenge in thinking through all this is there will clearly be risks because there's a perception of choosing sides. As if China and the US continue to decouple, they're both going to be asking in a geopolitical sense and an economic sense who's much more aligned one way or the other. Obviously, as an African American, as an American, I hope people in this room are much more aligned to the US because I think trade behaviors are much more equal, democracy to democracy. And so I think an opportunity and a challenge is how does African nations, how do the Caribbean nations think about aligning themselves carefully between the US and China, knowing that there's not just economics at stake, but political issues at stake as well. Does that make sense?
Yeah, makes a lot of sense, and it's Africa as a.
We're chuckling because it makes a lot of sense.
it's Africa as part of the China +1 or China +2 strategy.
I think that's right, and so again, a question is, how do you make the terms of trade work? This has always been a question of trade. How do you make the terms of trade work for your own national interests? Because it's pretty clear that vis-a-vis, with all honesty, vis-a-vis Russia, vis-a-vis China, and yes, vis-a-vis the US, the terms of trade are more likely to work for the bigger party because of stronger negotiating position, et cetera. But that then drives to the question of, well, okay, what does one have to do to create more resiliency within the context that you've made, the continent itself, in terms of education, most importantly in terms of finding pools of capital that I would describe as sort of more friendly. And so you and I both know that there are many Western investors, you are among them, I may be among them, interested in finding great opportunities to bring Western savings in a equitable way to start up businesses and new ideas in Africa. Not just at small scale, but also large scale. And so, I think there are ways to manage the obvious conflict between China and the US that could be quite beneficial, because the US is not just the government entity, which is mainly true in China, but also private sector that's looking for really interesting alternatives.
So you touch on a very important thing. For growth, you need finance.
Absolutely.
Clearly, institutions like African Export-Import Bank are playing a stellar role in financing the development of Africa under the exemplary, outstanding leadership of President Dr. Orama, who's sitting there. Let's give him a big hand, please. And there are other institutions as well playing a major role. And global Africans, the 2 billion people, I think will increasingly fund that growth. But the question for you is, US is still the mecca of capital. If I remember a McKinsey study at some point of time, it said there is $87 trillion of global investable capital, of which 73 trillion, the numbers may have changed, are in the United States of America. What can African financial sector leaders, African political leaders do to change the perception of risk of investing in Africa? Because still a lot of capital doesn't go into Africa because of perception of risk, which probably outweighs the reality.
Well, one, the perception of risk does outweigh the reality. So what does that mean? First, actively educating private sector players in the US that are big pools of capital about what the opportunities are in Africa is very important. So I don't know how many of you have gone to talk to, let's say, Larry Fink, who runs, one of our largest pools of capital in the US, BlackRock, or any of the others. So that's the first thing, right? The second is to also understand, how to turn the African story, continent-wide, country by country, into something that people really understand, which is this is diversification. When I talk to people about why invest in emerging markets, as they're called, the diversification story is a really important one, not to be ignored, as is the question of the future. So the demographic dividend that's possible is very important. Third thing, talk about the great strengths that Africa has. So think about the jump to the iPhone, or since I'm on the board of Alphabet, I should say the Pixel phone. Here we have a group that's already ready to be completely digital. So that's the second or third. The fourth, though, is to also recognize what are the weaknesses that actually are legitimate to worry about. And the biggest one in terms of risk is one that is visible to all of you and visible to all of us, which is the currency risk. Right? So US investors, European investors are obviously looking for return in dollar terms. And how one thinks about the ups and downs, some pretty dramatic, in the value of local currencies is going to be critically important. And so let's be honest about what the challenges are. Let's think through those solutions. And some of those solutions may well be creating new capital markets capabilities that don't currently exist. So it is very difficult, I know from personal experience, to hedge local currency exposure in almost any African nation or other nations outside of the US. Why is that the case? We'll have to think it through. So, count me very optimistic in this world of reglobalization. Another shot for the various African nations represented here in the Caribbean nations to play a really, really important role, in part because the strengths that African nations and Caribbean nations have are now, I think, more relevant than others. But it's got to be particularly well managed when it comes to using capital, dealing with the demographic dividend. What's the role that these nations can play as China resorts itself and the US resorts its relationship with China? And how do you think about being on the winning end of some of these major challenges that we've talked about, climate change, education, et cetera? Those are some of the things I'd be thinking about if I were a policymaker or a business leader represented in this room.
We have covered a lot of topics. And it's been a very rich conversation. So one last thing. Where do you see the Fed rate December 2024?
So look, I've been in the camp that says the possibility of a rate cut 50-50. I do not think there's going to be, there was a point when the US markets were expecting 6, then 5, then 4 cuts. Now, this morning there was pretty good inflation news, so the markets are expecting somewhere between 1 and 2 cuts. I think maybe 1 towards the end of the year. And so the big theme is I wouldn't look to the Fed to bail out anybody by getting interest rates very low anytime soon.
So, okay, let me follow that up with an easy question.
Okay.
Outcome of the US presidential election.
Closer than one would like to think, given that we've got a perfectly sensible senior statesman running against a person who's now, who's got quite a history. We'll put it that way. But to be very serious, the reason this is close, and this is really important, is because it may be true in some of your countries as well. We have had a long, long period of some of the challenges I've talked about: income and wealth inequality, health inequality, et cetera. And the reason we have populism now in the US, as represented by Donald Trump, is not that he created this, but that he became the voice of it. And so, one can have whatever view you have of the man, the character, et cetera, but you must respect and understand that he is the embodiment of very legitimate concerns by a large number of Americans. Fine, you can dispute me, but I'd like to tell the truth. And we have a large number of people in the United States who are feeling very disaffected. We have a large number of people who feel that they have no future. You heard me talk about some of the issues that the Edelman folks have found. And so, I am not in any sense an apologist for Donald Trump. I am not at all. But I'm also, as a policymaker, and I would encourage all of you as business leaders and policymakers to recognize the underlying dissatisfaction that's leading to some of these challenges.
Terrific. So they used to say it's the economy stupid. I think increasingly we need to say it's the politics stupid.
Or maybe it's stupid politics.
All stupid politics.
All right.
Okay. Thank you so much for this excellent insights and views, Roger. Brilliant. I think Alan Greenspan said it right, and I'm just quoting him, when he said that Dr. Roger Ferguson is one of the most effective vice chairs in the history of the Federal Reserve, I think.
Reports that we're officially launching today. The flagship Africa Trade Report for 2024, which has been themed Climate Implications of the AfCFTA Implementation, and the Maiden 2024 Africa Trade and Economic Outlook Report. Debates and conversations over the last decade has been the global climate system. It is also well understood that, and widely accepted, that while Africa bears the brunt of climate change events, the continent's carbon emissions are the lowest in the world, estimated at just about 3% of global carbon emissions. At the same time, the urgent need to fulfill its development aspirations and economic transformation, which partly led to the development of the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement, has created debate about the potential impact of the AfCFTA on carbon emissions and the need to strike a balance between its development and economic transformation goals and climate considerations. Now, from this conversation, two schools of thought have emerged. While both groups acknowledge the fact that the AFCTA has significant development benefits to Africa and its successful implementation will trigger accelerated development and economic transformation in the continent, one group also believes that the drive for industrialization and the associated increase in urbanization would worsen carbon emissions. On the other hand, the second group maintains that by emphasizing intra-African trade and reducing extra-African trade, carbon emissions generated will be lowered through shorter shipping distances. It is against this backdrop that this study was conducted in the 2024 Africa Trade Report with the objective of assessing empirically the relative impact of the AFCFTA implementation on carbon emissions in Africa. Using data from Global Trade Analysis Project e-Power model and the computable general equilibrium model as the analytical framework, the report concludes that the AFCFTA provides a route towards meeting the developmental aspirations of African countries while at the same time addressing climate change concerns. In other words, the implementation of the AFCFTA also serves as a strategy towards reducing carbon emissions in the continent. Your Excellencies, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, 2023, as we're all aware, was a challenging period not just for the African continent, but for the global economy. The year was characterized by slower economic growth, rising inflation, and general disruptions in macroeconomic stability. However, while global and African trade declined overall, intra-African trade improved, reflecting the resilience of the African economy on the one hand, and on the other hand, the potential of the AFCFTA by boosting intra-African trade as a tool to hedge against global shocks. Our analysis in the report also revealed large untapped potential in intra-African trade, especially with respect to machinery, electricity, motor vehicles, and food products. Our outlook for 2024 and 2025, however, despite the very challenging economic environment in 2023, remains positive, and we expect most macroeconomic indicators to improve in 2024 and 2025. Growth is expected to be stronger in 2024 than it was in 2023, and also be higher than the global average. Inflation, though still currently high, is expected to reduce, and we expect that trend to continue downwards for the rest of the year into 2025. Debt pressure is easing. Debt indicators are generally expected to improve. Intra-African trade, we expect, is going to continue improving. And we also expect to anticipate a more stable exchange rate environment. And this expectation is backed by the improving economic environment, generally as a result of improving economic activity across the continent and in key African markets globally. Also, as the growth-limiting effects of weather shocks subside, as supply bottlenecks gradually improve, and energy reliability for manufacturing output improves, including a rebound in infrastructure investment spending, a recovery in tourism arrivals following the COVID-19 pandemic, and the benefits of economic diversification, stronger commodity prices, various fiscal monetary policies being introduced by various countries, and also the various financial support and initiatives by multilateral development financial institutions like the African Export-Import Bank. We believe that all of these factors will lead to a better 2024 than 2023. I will end this brief overview by saying that the AFCFTA, as illustrated by the findings in this report, is a key intervention with capacity to drive global Africa's development and structural transformation with little impact on carbon emissions, especially if the focus is to promote trade among global Africans. Your Excellencies, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, against this backdrop, I'm pleased to invite the President and Chairman of the Board of the African Export-Import Bank, Professor Benedict Orama, together with the Deputy Chairperson of the African Union, as well as the Executive Director, International Trade Center, to come and launch both reports. Thank you.